Hi, Monica. Hi, Adrian.
Hello.
Alison,
Hi.
how are
So,
you? How are you? Are you in Cambridge right now?
Yeah, I'm in Cambridge at Westminster College. And this is the third of 4 days of totally booked schedule with the McDonald Institute. I'm a bit fried at the moment,
Oh,
but
that's good. I'm also fried. Like I'm on the fourth of 5 days with New Europe College and Sophia doing this like archaeology stuff. So my brain is like completely.
where are you now?
I'm in Bucharest.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so there's this summer school where there was 3 days of lectures, and then today was a workshop on what art history and archaeology can learn from each other.
Oh, cool.
Um, I
Yeah.
think the answer was art history and archaeology are both confusing. And tomorrow is kind of presentations from the students who have come to the summer school. Um,
Uh-huh.
and then in the weekend, we're supposed to sort of visit museums, but I think I shall lie in my hotel room, kind of in a ball.
Gasp. Yeah. I appreciate the feeling.
What are you doing in the McDonald Institute? What have they got going at the moment?
I gave this year's McDonald Institute lecture.
Hmm.
Apparently they're 33rd, which is hard to believe because it seemed like just yesterday that they got the big funding and stuff. And then they just organized a bunch of meetings with staff and students. So it's been really fun. It's the first kind of big trip I've made. So
It's quite
and I guess everybody,
surreal.
the mask rules in the UK have been relaxed, and I'm a little unnerved by them because the Canadian Advisory Directory is basically level 4. Do not go to the UK.
I mean, I did my first sort of proper international travel like about 6 weeks ago, where I sort of went to the States and then to Denmark and then to Germany. And it was very
wow.
funny going to, I was in South Bend, no masks. Denmark, not even a hint of a mask. Germany, masks. It was like, oh no, that's right.
Yeah. At home, we're wearing masks in indoor public spaces and then optionally otherwise. It's totally confusing. So I just hope I don't like come down with the dread COVID.
Yeah. No,
But anyway, yeah. So I wanted to ask Alexander, you had a little icon that looked like a dragon or something. What was that?
Oh, thank you. It's my heraldic badge, which was it's a sort of lizard saurus. It's a Griffonosaurus. I'm sorry. It's half griffon, which is also half lion and half eagle, and then another half is a lizard. It was granted for me by a friend who is also interested in heraldry as I am, well, as he put it, as a sort of acknowledging my kindness towards heraldic and other beasts. So I like to use it. It's a very hybrid heraldic beast and rather unique.
Can you explain the heraldic symbolism behind this quarter lion, quarter eagle, half lizard?
Well, griffon as it is of course, well, this is a kind of normal griffon, which is fore part of eagle and hind part of lion. And there are other kinds of griffin, as we all know, hippogriff and something called male griffin. It's a griffin without wings but with spikes. It's the sort of heraldic misunderstanding of medieval text and so forth. It's quite a long story, but the symbolic of this particular badge is it's a griffin and a lizard, which were both sort of very favorite heraldic beasts of my late friend, and he joined them into this badge, and I like to use it not as a coat of arms, but because it's a kind of presumptuous, but the badge is rather, in a heraldical sense, it's nicer and less presumptuous. That's a symbolic. Well,
Could you show it again? Anyway, I know this
Yes,
is not
yes,
relevant to
You
the
switch the
seminar, but
camera.
it's so
No, this is very,
striking.
this is,
I love
this is
it.
very
Here it
important.
Yeah.
so
Oh, yeah, there's lizard.
this is lizard, of course, and it's holding its tail like Ouroboros. It's a kind of. I like to use it on my stationery, and now is a good
It's
time.
lovely.
Yes.
Hopefully we can all agree that by not starting each session with a quick lesson in heraldry, we've really missed an important we really missed out by not doing this at the start of each session. So welcome everyone to, this has been an incredibly quick 7 weeks, but welcome to sort of the final session of this course, I suppose we might call it. Thank you so much for, I have learned an enormous amount from this, and I've been really gratified by you all sort of coming along on this weird experiment. I think it's worked, sort of. And unsurprisingly, the perfect person to sort of end this is Alison Wylie. We had a sort of this is going to be an interesting 40 hour and a half. So Alison, the way that we've been running this is the first half, I will kind of more or less interview you, and then we'll have a quick break, and then everyone will come in and we'll have a sort of pile on. And so the way that I've been starting this is really to sort of, and this for you, in a sense, this for you is kind of a bigger question that it has been for the other people we've spoken to, but I'm sure it's one we're all interested in. How did you kind of get into this kind of philosophy and archaeology kind of business, right? And so one thing for those of you who are, I mean, I'm sure we all sort of know Alison quite well, but just a quick anecdote to sort of set this up. When I was in Calgary, we had a workshop that Alison was coming to that was a sort of, philosophy something. And the archaeologists, when they found out about this, were, if anything, quite offended, because from their perspective, Alison's an archaeologist. And they had this attitude of what is Alison? Why is she going to talk to you? She's our person. And there was this kind of sense of ownership, which I thought was quite telling. So I'd be really interested to hear just a bit of background in terms of how it is what's the story of you sort of getting into being a sort of philosopher who does archaeo philosopher, however you want to characterize yourself.
Yeah, well, I get asked that a lot. And so when I was putting together the essays that make up this book I published on thinking from things, the editor said, I get asked this a lot. You better write what he called a personal foreword and explain yourself. So I did. So there's a bit there. And the short story is that my parents were very serious avocational archaeologists, and a good friend of my father's, his name was Pendergast, Jim Pendergast. They were both military. They retired from Canadian military, and Pendergast became an associate or assistant director of the Canadian National Museum. Anyway, but as a kid, they would all line up their holidays and take their families to document, to excavate, survey, whatever, a site that the National Museum wanted documented along the St. Lawrence River near Kingston, down in that region. And so as a kid, I was on these sites from the time I was, 8 or 9 or something. And I thought this was cruel and unusual punishment, and nobody should have to stand there and hold a stadia rod. And I mean, everybody else I knew got to go learn how to canoe, and I had to, these military engineers were surveying these tiny sites within an inch of their lives. I thought this was hideous. But when I needed a summer job, Parks Canada was initiating, I had a couple years ago before, this was in the early to mid 70s, they'd initiated a program of historic archaeology on sites that they wanted to develop as Canadian historic park sites. And I needed a summer job, and I had a really good family reference and got this job as a site assistant. So I then discovered I actually really loved doing archaeology. I was going to a tiny college in the Maritimes in Canada, in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, right on the border. There wasn't any anthropology or archaeology being taught there when I was there. So I was doing field work in the summers for Parks Canada. I guess I worked for them about 5 or 6 summers, and studying philosophy. Just got drawn to philosophy. So it was like my day job and my night, my summer job and my winter job, right? And luckily I had a philosophy of science. He must have been like 10 years old. He must have just gotten his doctorate and started teaching, but he seemed vastly old to me at the time. He'd been trained as a chemist, and he was really committed to doing philosophy of science in close engagement with actual science practice. So he encouraged all of us to be thinking about some particular example of science practice and develop projects and readings and so on related to that. So I started reading around. The new archaeology was taking shape. Archaeologists were citing Hempel and Kuhn, and they were saying they were having a Kuhnian revolution to become Hempelian positivists. And even as a second-year undergraduate philosopher, I thought that doesn't quite work. So anyway, it's the connection started to be made for me really, both in that philosophy of science class, which was in my second year as an undergraduate, but also in the field where there was ongoing active debate about the new archaeology guidelines. So that's where it started. And I had the good fortune to do doctoral work in a program that no longer exists, History and Philosophy of Social Behavioral Sciences, that required you to get an undergrad or get an MA level of training in whatever social science you were studying. And if you didn't, I came in as just with an undergraduate degree. So I was expected to get the equivalent of a master's level training. At the time, this was at Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton, there was a very strong enclave of new archaeologists or new and affiliated archaeologists. Meg Conkey, John Fritz, Chuck Redman, I don't know if those names are familiar, but a whole clutch of them. So I was able to, sort of work back and forth between philosophy of social behavioral sciences and archaeology training. Ram Hare was my thesis supervisor, and I thought the analysis he was making at the time in social psychology, that what was wrong with behaviorism and why a scientific realist orientation or framing got much closer to grasping, making sense of the ambitions of social psychologists. And that seemed, I didn't ever directly apply sort of that Hare framework to archaeology, but it was inspiring because the new archaeologists were, of course, arguing we need to do more than just describe the data, if that's even possible. We need to understand about the past and explain the past. And it seemed to me a way of framing that philosophically was to say, contra the advocacy for logical empiricism, you don't want to just save the phenomena. You want to look beyond the phenomena. You want to be modeling antecedent processes and events. You want to be building an understanding of things that are not, not reducible to phenomena. So that's how it came together. So I've always, I guess the first paper I ever gave was in an archaeology at the Society for American Archaeology, but I've always worked in both fields.
That's kind of remarkable. That's so
Yeah.
remarkable, the sort of that confluence that you sort of described, where it's amazing. I mean, that the idea of having a kind of philosophy degree that requires that level of training in the science, that's amazing. Like,
and my whole career, I've been trying to find ways unsuccessfully of trying to cultivate a program that wouldn't just, like the University of Pittsburgh History Philosophy of Science, a lot of their PhDs come in with a PhD or something close to it in a science and train up in history and philosophy of science. I would love to see a program that really supported you to do the science training alongside the HPS. And funding streams being what they are, admissions protocols being what they are, I've never found a space where it was possible to create a program like the one I was in. The guy who set that program up, his name was Ted Michel. He was a philosopher of psychology, psychiatry. And sadly, he died suddenly of a fast-moving cancer the second year of the program. And the funding got pulled and moved to other places. They weren't ever able to recruit a replacement for him. So most of the students in that program who came in with MAs in the social science went back to their graduate programs to do doctorates at the University of Chicago or Harvard or Princeton, which is actually where they, there were super well-trained social scientists who wanted to be in that program and be doing philosophy. And there's never been a program that would serve that interest again.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, you can definitely imagine, like, you could imagine a sort of master's program or something similar being a kind of hub for people who are both folks who see themselves on a sort of social science trajectory or something like that, and those who see themselves on a philosophy trajectory, who are sort of coming together. And like that would be a really interesting way of thinking about what that sort of program could be like.
And
but I can definitely,
I was going to say, especially salient now, given the science and values, movement within philosophy of science, and much more not totally mainstream, but interest in policy issues.
This is a good, actually, this is slightly off topic, but I can't resist. There's a sense in which your work now is, what's the way of putting it? I'm trying to find a way of saying that you're ahead of your time without being so cheesy, but basically, like, your work now makes a lot more sense in the landscape of the philosophy of science than it did when you were writing it. And I guess maybe an interesting question is, how did you sort of conceive of your work at that time, right? Because from my perspective, looking back, when I read that work, it seems very, and two things to sort of constrain the question by. One is, I'm very aware that philosophers are very good at belaboring under extremely idealized conceptions of our own history. So it could be that actually there's a heap of people doing stuff and you didn't at all feel like what you were doing was particularly out of the ordinary. But certainly now it's sort of, your work seems to sort of fit very nicely into the sorts of things that philosophers of science are often doing. But our perception of what philosophers of science were doing when you were sort of starting out is one that was very different. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. What to say? I mean, there was a turn within philosophy of science already since the 70s. People raging against philosophy of science that was informed by kind of textbook idealizations. Fantasy physics was one terminology used, right? Rather than actual scientific practice. So that turn had been made. And I think that was crucial for things like the development of philosophy of biology as a, tremendously robust field that emerged roughly at that time. And not so much the philosophy of the social science or philosophy of chemistry also. So I think once the move was made within philosophy of science, you need to attend to the history, which at the time was more a sort of intellectual technical history, and to the practice and to the substance of the sciences you're studying. That opened the door to focusing on particular sciences and not assuming that if you got an idealized picture of physics worked out, that would just apply to, all other sciences. I'm thinking of, Hempel on the function of laws, general laws in history, like get the covering law model, apply it to whatever field. If it has pretensions to being scientific, this is how it has to be. Well, that people were within philosophy of science, that was the space that made it possible for me to be doing what I do as philosophy of science. So, there's more respect within philosophy and philosophy of science for people working on physics. Not so much they were a little puzzled about archaeology, but I would guess some percentage of colleagues had wanted to be an archeologist when they were 10 years old. So they were willing to.
Frankly, they still are a bit confused, I find.
Yeah. But they're willing to listen, and they weren't, at least among philosophers of science, they weren't prepared to say, as when I was interviewing for jobs, well, half of your publications or a third of them or whatever are in archaeology. And of course, we're not going to count those when we, bring you up for tenure. You're going to have to just do philosophy. Philosophers of science, that, I ended up in a department very strong in philosophy of science. They valued philosophy that seriously engaged the science. So that was the first move. And, there were people doing some work on archaeology. Marilee Salmon and Wes Salmon had done some work. Marcia Hannon, who was a philosopher of law and evidence issues in law and science, worked with an archaeologist, Jane Kelly, and they did a book on archaeology and the methodology of science, which was essentially kind of working with inference to the best explanation as a frame for understanding archaeological reasoning. Yeah, I mean, there were maybe half a dozen people who, given their philosophical interests or their connections to archaeologists, were sort of dipping into the field. I don't think any of them did field work, not that that's absolutely necessary. Peter Casso did some really interesting philosophy of archaeology, and his wife was maybe still, I don't know her, but she was a classical archaeologist. And so he spent time on sites with her in Greece, I believe. So, you know, there were people around. It wasn't impossible to imagine working on this, but the crucial thing was that the field had opened up just that bit. You know, I think of it as contextual turn in philosophy of science. And then when you move forward, I mean, it was because of archaeological interests and invitations that I started thinking about ethics issues in archaeology. So, you know, in the early 90s, colleagues who were on the executive board for the Society for American Archaeology got hold of me and said, we need you to write us a brief on looted data, on the ethics issues to do with looted and illegally sold and circulated archaeological material. And I said, you know, that's like asking a linguist to provide a brief on something in physical anthropology. I mean, I'm not an ethicist. Yeah. Right, as a philosopher. And they said, that doesn't matter, you know, the archaeologists. Well, but there are archaeologists who are writing on these issues and really know them, know the law, know, you know, reading the ethics. No, we need somebody who's like doesn't have a dog in the race, or whatever the phrase is, like, is, you know, dog in the fight, is that it?
You have a pony in the show? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I think skin in the game.
Yeah. So I was skin in the game. So I was like adjacent. They could trust me to know enough archaeology to know what the stakes were, but I wasn't going to be defending one use or another particularly. And they didn't really care. I was a philosopher, so I should be able to do ethics, right? Anyway, that was super interesting. And that was transformative for me because, I mean, there were these issues about looted data, but you very quickly get into epistemic territory. And questions about normative, norms of justification, for example, and issues of stewardship. I was involved in co-convening a working group for the Society for American Archaeology that ultimately drafted their ethics principles, which are grounded in a principle of stewardship. It's problematic, but it was worth doing. So it was the archaeologists who made me do it. They made me think outside the box of, even within contextualist kind of philosophy of science, nobody much apart from the inductive risk people were thinking about the role of values in science. And they certainly weren't thinking about them in the way that Heather Douglas and others since have done, that it's not just at the beginning and end of a research, episode that the values come in, but rather that values inform what you're going to count as data, how you're going to curate it, how you interpret it as evidence. So that's another, it was the engagement with archaeology that really configured my thinking, which now, I mean, the ethics stuff was quite separate from evidential reasoning, but I can now kind of see how to put that together given where the field's gone.
One of the things and this is going to start leading us into sort of the story of this particular paper that we're already starting to sort of move towards, I can see, is one thing I really found really interesting about the way you were sort of describing your role, which is something that I've always found interesting about your papers in philosophy of archaeology, where often you seem to have it's this role that I kind of wish I could have sometimes, where somehow you're able to sort of hold an attitude of kind of, there's a perfect word for it and I don't have it, but there's a kind of, it's like you're acting as a kind of judicious intermediary. You're sort of going, hey, you guys are having these arguments, here's how I sort of see these arguments go. And one of the things I often find quite amusing about this is like, I often feel like reading between the lines, actually, you have quite firm opinions about where you fall on this. And you can see that actually you're the master of something once you think it through. That's actually quite a brutal argument, but it's put in such a sort of, what's the way of putting it, sort of just judicious kind of way. And I think this paper is a nice example of this, where you have this incredibly thorny set of kind of, I guess you want to say ethical and political and empirical issues that are kind of tied up into this knot. And you have this capacity to sort of kind of wander in and just kind of help organize things a bit for people in this like way, which is like very useful. And I guess maybe that was more of a comment. Maybe sort of so this paper in particular, it'd be interesting to hear sort of how you came to write it and what your sort of goals were. What's the story of this particular paper?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the terminology, I don't know if this has been part of your discussion, but interactional expertise from Collins and Evans.
We have not talked about that, so please enlighten us as to it.
Yeah. So I came upon this language of theirs just in the last decade. It certainly didn't inform what I'd been doing over some years before that. But as sociologists of science, they have this what they call the periodic table of expertises. It's a little cute, and there's baggage that comes with it that I don't love. But I do like the distinction between what they call contributory expertise, which is the kind of expertise a researcher has in their specialism, and the kind of interactional expertise that they likely have with respect to the work that specialists in neighboring areas are doing, or even more broadly, sometimes they use the example of somebody who's like the director of a big, like a CERN, research facility. You could not run the experiment. You could not, fine tune the statistical analysis, but you have the kind of interactional expertise that means you grasp what it is they're doing and you can communicate with them. And that's the kind of expertise that I think as science studies people and philosophers of science, that's what we need with the science that we're working with. I think it does help if you've done some specialist work, so you know what the discipline requires. And particularly with a field like archaeology, some field work really gives you a sense of grounds your understanding of what then appears in publications. So interactional expertise is how I've been thinking about, how I'm positioning myself. It means I have to learn from archaeologists and their publications and their debates what the stakes are. I can't come in with a philosophical frame and say, oh, you're using, like back in the day, why did I start writing these things about positivism and new archaeology and so on? I was like, there were philosophers who intervened and basically kind of smacked around the archaeologists and said, you guys just, you don't understand our literature. You don't know what logical empiricism is. You're all washed up. Let me school you in how to use this terminology. And I just thought, whoa, you just like totally do not get what the moves are that these people are making. So maybe Hempel was not the right source, but the motivations are philosophically way more interesting than the use that the programmatic use they're using Hempel for. So anyway, that was the motivation back then. Fast forward to work on a collaborative practice. The politics, so at the time I was working on the SAA ethics initiative in the early 90s, that's when the Native American Grave Protection Repatriation Act was voted in the US federally in 1990. And it's federal legislation, it's well known, it's quite distinctive, but there's similar legislation and heritage legislation and regulation in like all kinds of contexts that were fundamentally game changers for archaeological practice. And at the time, especially around repatriation of human remains, there was really sharp conflict within the field. Like there were people who were doubling down on, these are our data, and no sort of parochial, local interest, descendant community interest should ever trump the value of these human remains, ancestral.
These are the property of all humanity, the sort of universalism sort of. Yeah.
And that fits with the new archaeology. Like if you're doing science, you're serving the interests, some kind of transcendent of all context interests. So I just thought that was so misguided, those arguments. I did have a strong view about it, but it was much informed by how the archaeological debate was unfolding. So initially, the intervention that I made is in a paper that's in a collection of essays on objectivity. Alan Richardson is, I think, the lead editor, maybe Jonathan Sue. But there I was trying to push back against the kind of epistemic ideals, value-free type ideal that seem to inform the views of these staunch recalcitrant critics of collaborative practice or repatriation. And very often the argument was, if you let these Minji Indians or whoever, in the door and talk to them and take seriously their interests, and God forbid that what they understand about their past, the archaeology is compromised. So that was the first round of criticism that I was recapitulating some of the analysis from that earlier paper and the one you've got. And I just thought, wow, what conception of science are you working with? This is, there may or may not be a case for a descendant community to claim, precedence, but you don't get off on just, you just can't be invoking this untenable set of epistemic ideals as a basis for carte blanche access and use and control. So that was the starting point there. And then the thing that really struck me was that the archaeologists who did, rather than doubling down and defending the discipline against all comers, the horrifying potential sources of bias, those who stepped up and tried to find ways to work more respectfully with stakeholders of various kinds, and especially really pushed for robust ongoing collaborative practice with Indigenous communities, which is the piece I know best. Rather than, very often they were charged with compromising the science, but they consistently say they've never done better science. So my initial project was like, better in what sense? Why do you think your science is better? So that was the initial project, but still, and I argued that, there are various ways of characterizing why better, but still this was sort of a defense of what I thought was a potentially meaningful intervention that really didn't compromise us. Jury's out. Some projects are good, some are bad. It's not a carte blanche. It's all okay if you're collaborating. But it's still centered on the payback, so to speak, to archaeology. I was focusing on ways in which collaborative practice raises the bar epistemically for archaeological practice in various ways. And increasingly, with this more recent paper, I'm interested in what happens when you recenter the project, not just on how well does archaeology do, but what can archaeology do in a world where colonial contestation over human remains, for example, is really salient. So I don't know if that exactly answers.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So moving, so maybe so of course, when I was reading this paper and when we were talking about it on Tuesday, one of the sort of crucial sort of linchpins, of course, is this is all playing out in this broader context of thinking about sort of decolonization and such. And I think it's probably worth sort of asking, getting your sort of sense of how you think how you think about, or how maybe perhaps you think we ought to sort of think about decolonization, because it's something which I sort of I feel sort of certain types of interesting pools about it. Maybe one way of putting it is something like this. There's this kind of famous sort of interesting critique of decolonization, at least as it plays out in academic contexts, which is this idea that you sort of turn decolonization into a metaphor, if that makes sense.
The Tuck and Yang objection.
Of course, yeah. So I guess I'm kind of interested in sort of seeing, because I have no idea what to think about that other than finding it very interesting. But considering that, I take it that one of the things you're doing in this paper is you're giving a really interesting kind of defense of, it's hard to describe, but a kind of very non-aggressive activism, if that makes sense. A sort of activism that involves a lot of kind of a lot of empathy and a lot of openness, which is often quite different to the way that people sort of frame those things. And so I suppose I'm kind of interested in, what do you make of this kind of worry about decolonization, where it basically boils down to kind of a sort of wet liberalism that allows, us settler colonists to kind of say sorry, but then continue living in the same way, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, so I just interested in your general thoughts on that question.
That's exactly what these lectures that I'm giving here at Cambridge and then UCL is on, exactly this.
So maybe if you could answer it more quickly than you did in the lectures.
No, you're not going to get the whole lecture. And I have more questions than answers actually on this. But yeah, the little segment of the paper you have on LaSalle and Hutchings, they do cite Tuck and Yang a couple of times. And Tuck and Yang, I think it's 2012. Decolonization is not a metaphor.
Yeah.
Or 2000. Yeah. It's a very, it's well worth a read. It's a very powerful critical paper. And they are saying that they are making the claim many others have criticized. For example, reconciliation efforts in Canada get indicted as merely performative. And decolonization can't be, decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing our fashion choices, decolonization has to be material. It has to be land back kind of issues. It has to be about sovereignty, at least in Canadian and BC context. So the Tuck and Yang argument is, the rubber has to hit the road. There really have to be structural and material changes. Significant changes to the way Indigenous peoples' rights are recognized in line with the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then other things they say in that article are to the effect that you should not, so settler moves to innocence, settler moves of evasion, which you're referring to, often involve like, I'm a good person, I'm not responsible for this, and I'm sorry, it doesn't count. You're a beneficiary, whether you made it happen or not. You need to think about your implication in a profoundly unjust system of dispossession of land and resources, and how that, benefits you in continuing processes that keep those colonial systems in place, internal colonialism I'm talking about. But they also, Indigenous arguments for activist initiatives on Indigenous rights cannot be subsumed under other social justice movements. They are distinct. So one example is like the Occupy movement, and they're really bent out of shape. That often Occupy movement, statements and speeches and commitments didn't recognize that this was, the representatives of the 90% occupying space that the 1% control, but in no recognition that all of that space had been appropriated from Indigenous landholders originally. They're on Indigenous territory. So that you can't, and they make other kinds of arguments for why Indigenous rights movements can't be subsumed under other social justice movements. They may overlap, there may be alliances and so on, but they insist they're always going to be, you should expect that they're going to be contingent and strategic. So the very idea that you would forge long-term collaborative relationships, don't delude yourself that you are necessarily, on the side of goodness and right and part of the solution. So LaSalle and Hutchings don't make a lot of use of the details of Tuck and Yang, but that argument is in the background. And I think it's a really important corrective. I mean, it's really important to have those objections in view. My critique of Tuck and Yang, or rather of LaSalle and Hutchings, is that they don't actually pay attention to what archaeologists are doing in particular and their discussions of these issues. So like no archaeologist doing collaboration, it's just settler strategies of evasion. You're part of the problem, and no matter how good of goodwill you are deepening and entrenching. So, and I just think that kind of absolutism is not going to serve anyone. So take the critical insights, but then think about what moves we can make given differential degrees of privilege and resource to make a difference. I really love a book by Alexis Shotwell on what is it? Living ethically in morally or living well in morally compromised times. I'm forgetting the title exactly. It's ethic, like impure, impurity, like moral, ethical impurity. And she makes the argument that, we are all implicated in institutions and structures that to some degree, in some ways, we repudiate. Your starting point has to be a recognition of complicity and entanglement in these systems, and then figure out what you can do that might make a difference. But also can always prepared to reassess whether what you're, because the way colonialism and other oppressive systems work is that they're very adept at appropriating, the language and resources and strategies of social movements and turning them against, right? So you always have to be looking to see, am I being conscripted into an agenda that I don't support? And think about reorienting given how those grounds are constantly shifting.
Right. So it's a sort of a continual process of, to some extent, even if you do something that is successful, it's very success will lead to certain forms of appropriation. And so it's this kind of ongoing unfolding. So I thought I really liked the way you sort of answered that question. And it sort of brought me into sort of one of the things that I thought was a really interesting move you make in the paper is the way that you deal with this kind of master's tools kind of complaint, which is sort of what we're talking about here, where, and I thought I take the move as something like, look, we shouldn't think of the master's tools as being the resources and the institutions per se. It's rather the strategies that are adopted towards creating these kinds of divisions. And there's this interesting sort of turn the tables move you make, where you're like, look, by thinking in these very extreme sort of black and white kinds of ways, that's in fact a strategy that counts as a master's tool. But using these intellectual, academic, institutional resources in order to sort of confront in these ways, in the way that good collaborative community archaeology does, is perhaps using the resources that the master sometimes uses, but it doesn't actually count as the master's tools. I took roughly the argument to be. And I thought that was sort of a really powerful move, because something that's interesting about that master's tools thing is it's got this, what's the way of putting it? There's a certain structure to a certain type of argument that's very convincing, where you go, oh, well, no one's going to teach you something that'll let you defeat them. And you go, that's very smart. And then you're able to critique lots of stuff. And I thought,
like reading.
Yeah, exactly.
Literacy.
Yes. I thought it was very adept the way you sort of turned that around. So maybe something that's going to come up a lot when we sort of open the floor to questions that it's maybe worth sort of foreshadowing. Is there something that, of course, is extremely striking when you read, this stuff and things on collaborative archaeology more generally, is there's often a very particular type of social structure in mind, right? These are very much written in what to me I would think of as kind of classical colonial contexts, right? So contexts where you have indigenous people who have been colonized by usually white Europeans. Maybe there's sort of a history of sort of slavery coming in as well. But of course, archaeology happens on a sort of wide variety. Something I've definitely learned in this conference I'm in Bucharest is that there's a whole range of really strange varieties of ways in which archaeology happens. And so I guess sort of a sort of question here is, how do you see these kinds of lessons or this kind of thinking stretching into sort of communities that look less directly like, or at least are more, that look less like communities where you have sort of the very clear settler and the very clear indigenous person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. First of all, just one comment on the master's tools. It's a little short article by Audre Lorde, which if you haven't read it, it's worth reading, because the analysis that I was using there, you see the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. The title gets cited everywhere. And very few people seem to actually bother to read the 3 pages of of the Audre Lorde piece. And she's the one who says the master's tools are whatever strategies and machinations masters use to divide the oppressed against themselves, against one another, so that they can't be effective. Keep them down by keeping them fighting among themselves. So it's not about, archaeology or medical tools, or, classic example, reading, right? So, US context, slavery context, it was illegal to teach someone enslaved how to read. Perfectly well understood how the master's tools of that sort could be used against them, right? So it's subversive to do Freirean literacy training. But anyway, just to recur to that, it's in that article. It's a really lovely short piece that I think everyone should read. And don't buy the, can't use the master's tools. But then it gets super complicated. And I think the short answer to your actual question is, I don't know how far the analysis travels. Whenever I've given a talk about collaborative practice in the UK, usually at Oxford or Cambridge, I get the question, well, but that's all what's going on in the, in the colonies. We're in the metropole, we're all indigenous, it doesn't affect us. And then usually the end of that kind of line of interrogation is, but surely, like, who should I be talking to? Surely you don't expect me to talk to Richard Pendragon. Do any of you know about Richard?
Please tell us if Richard Pendragon knows.
No, you tell about Richard Pendragon.
No, I genuinely don't know what you're referring to.
Oh, Richard Pendragon, he's a druid. Yeah, he's a self-identified
yes,
druid,
I do know
performance. He's a performance artist. He's a kind of,
yeah.
Richard as in Richard,
Well, maybe another way of putting it is something like, as a collaborative archaeologist, you probably don't want to speak to British people who proudly proclaim themselves to be Indigenous British people.
Well, now that gets complicated quickly, but my response to that kind of challenge, like, surely I shouldn't have to. And so Richard Pendragon said, was sort of self-proclaiming leader of New Age Druids, and they should have access to Stonehenge to do solstice celebrations. Stonehenge was closed to the public in the interest of, protecting Stonehenge for the greater public. And, so some of the arguments sound similar. Like they have a particular interest and stake in access to Stonehenge. And my response to that was, well, I don't think there's going to be any principle that will tell you who you don't have to talk to. You probably have to sit down and talk to Richard Pendragon and find out what his interests are. And from what I've heard, people like Mike Parker Pearson, who is a big Stonehenge guy, does talk to Richard Pendragon. And often, I don't know how those conversations have gone, but often, at least in North American context, you'll get, say, sport climbers who want access to the Black Hills. And it's a very sacred site for Indigenous summer solstice ceremony. And so, they'll get really stroppy, like, I'm an American citizen, I pay taxes, I get to climb on whatever I want to climb on. But if this might not happen now, but 15 years ago, there were these accounts of park rangers sitting, walking people in who insisted they needed to be able to climb or observe, and giving them an opportunity to respectfully observe. And then apparently the upshot was they came away saying, okay, I'll climb at a different time. I kind of get it. This is really significant. And it doesn't trump altogether my right to climb whatever I want to climb, but maybe I'll adjust when I do, So that's a kind of good news story. It's not always going to work out that way, particularly in a social media polarized environment. But I think that kind of negotiation has to happen. Maybe that's the one lesson I would take forward, is that you have to have conversations with stakeholders. So yeah, Gonzalez Ruibal, I was quite taken aback by this argument that he and others were making, that, we know what's, we have a class-based analysis, a political analysis, and we know what's right for you, benighted people who don't understand your class position or your interests. And we're going to use archaeology to inform you. It's like, wow, you could probably learn a lot from people who, about what their interests are and why they're taking the stand they are.
Yeah, I thought one thing you did in the paper that was really interesting was capturing, because I feel this huge tension between those things. And part of this, I think, comes from me being one of the great advantages of being sort of a, white colonial is I have skin in so few games that it's it's very easy for me to find myself very much pulled in the that sort of that sort of move that says, no, as an archaeologist, I'm an expert in these things and I'm able to go in and and when the people who are sort of saying that sort of thing are coming from communities that I'm not familiar with, I find it very difficult to sort of know how to respond. And I think the answer you gave there, I thought, was sort of very telling. Just for me, something that I really would love for you to sort of walk me through is this notion you kind of use of a dis-narrative. I thought that was very striking. Like, I couldn't quite tell whether it was just a sort of, I felt like it wasn't just a narrative of sort of interesting failure. It felt like there was something a bit richer going on there. So could you sort of tell me what you had in mind by this idea?
Yeah, so that I did not know. I mean, it's a literary term, I gather, and I'm sure some of you know, and many of you probably know more about the literary use and background than I do. But I was alerted to it by my colleague, John Beatty, who's a philosopher of biology, evolutionary theory. And he has contributed a couple of papers to special issues that Mary Morgan, and who is she working with? Anyway, it's a research network.
Norton Wise, I think was.
And Norton Wise, that's it. Yeah. On narrative. And their special issues bring together people like Norton Wise, historian of physics, with Mary Morgan, history, philosophy of economics, and a whole range of other people. And John Beatty, for example, who are exploring, so narrative is often, like monster bard. Like, if you're doing narrative, you're not doing real science, just report the facts and draw the conclusions and don't mess around with storytelling. Right? And many of the contributors to that project in these two special issues are pointing out how even in the most sort of stripped down canonical scientific reporting, narrative is driving the story or driving the argument, and narrative structures and narrative turns and narrative strategies are configuring the science in quite deep ways. And John was looking at this in connection with evolutionary theory. So, he was, it's worth looking at his papers. I don't know that I'm going to be able to reconstruct exactly how he uses it, but his point is that when you're explaining how an evolutionary process, biological evolutionary process unfolds, it often seems like you get from some improbable starting position to a final position, and each step looks kind of determining, radically contingent, and yet the whole thing is determined. What he's saying is that instead of that, and I guess in the background is the, sort of rerunning the tape of time, like, could it go out differently and stuff like that. And if it could go differently, if the contingencies are such that the outcomes could be radically different, then do you have an explanation? Is it explicable? That's the kind of puzzle. And what he's arguing is that, you may have these start conditions, and then at every juncture, there are a range of possibilities. And it's the paths not taken that provide you explanatory leverage for understanding the course of the process as it's ongoing. And I just found that really kind of inspiring. Like, it doesn't relate to, it was sort of a happenstance of what I was reading for a class and reading with John at the same time as I was writing this paper, but it just struck me that if you want genealogies, as it were, accounts of how collaborative practice works as part of keeping people honest and being accountable for what works and what doesn't, it's the dis narratives, the paths not taken, the failings, the friction, the difficulties are going to be as informative as the kind of, we got from here to there smoothly, and it was always going to turn out, right? Or not turn out.
Yeah, right. One way of putting it is the last thing you want with collaborative archaeology is someone saying, "Oh, it was fine. I did it. There was no problems.
Yeah.
It was just, that doesn't tell you how to do collaborative archaeology. This just tells you this person got lucky or something.
Well, or the other, or like, everything goes to hell in a handbasket all the
Yeah.
time. Why bother?
Right.
I mean, I remember people in various contexts, University of Michigan some years ago, saying, well, why should we try to collaborate with Indigenous people? I mean, they're fighting among themselves, right? There's, they don't know what they want. So why should we pay attention to their claims? And it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many ways to respond to that. Like, why do you think they're put at odds with one another? Like consider European, Euro-American property regimes imposed on use rights and traditional, relations between communities that just absolutely don't fit that mold. I mean, that's one response. But the other is, if you take that line, because things could go wrong or they have gone wrong, there's no way to make it work reliably, you shouldn't bother. It's like, whoa, that's
there's an interesting excuse there. Where it's something like I set a bar very high, and because I can't jump over that bar, I don't have to do it at all.
Yeah.
It's a bit self-fulfilling. So if we need to go to a break very soon, but I do want to sort of finish by sort of ask. I think one of the things that's very striking about this piece, I think a lot of it is this sort of, when I take the sort of first principle of the three principles you kind of draw out of these papers, and this is this notion that sort of collaborative archaeology is about kind of challenging and changing archaeology in these really, I guess, just sort of fundamental or critical kind of ways. And I suppose I don't so much have a question about that, so much as sort of an invitation for you to sort of reflect on what sorts of things you kind of have in mind, or what's important about that feature of collaborative archaeology, where it's not simply about, as it were, sort of archaeology being built towards, as it were, sort of social justice issues, if you want, but also archaeology itself being transformed as being a sort of fundamentally important part of it. So yeah, I'd just be really interested in you sort of cashing that aspect of this out.
Oh, that's so hard.
I know.
Yeah, I think of the work that you do on Pursuit and some of what you say at the end of Rock, Bone, and Ruin about what kinds of inquiry and what kinds of epistemic goods we should value. And one of the things that makes collaborative practice, collaborative archaeology really hard is that our funding and institutional reward structures absolutely mitigate against doing collaborative work. Not just because of ideals, like you can't let these non-professionals have any influence on what questions you ask or how you address them. That's the first round of reaction. But because it is an uncertain process, because it's always very contingent. The kind of trust that's necessary to do this work is always fragile. And you need to spend, like typically for the Indigenous cases that I know, they're only going to work if somebody is willing to commit in the long term to doing the work. The sort of hit and run or drive by or helicopter archaeology, you drop in for a season or two, and then you go to some other part of the world and you build a big narrative about, about agriculture or crop management or, social structures, looking at Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica and whatever else, not that everybody doing that kind of comparative work does that kind of drop by archaeology, but that can't be the model. That kind of extractive archaeological practice, is just not, it's not going to cut it. So making a deep commitment to work with a community or a couple of communities over the long term automatically means, in the current kind of choice architecture and reward structure system, automatically means that you're not likely to get the kind of high profile recognition that you would if you're doing drive-by comparative kind of work. So that's one thing. And another, in addition to just the uncertainty of what you'll get out of it, right? So we would need to value goods other than, a paper published in Science or a paper published in American Antiquity or whatever. We need to find ways to recognize and value Well, first of all, to support the long-term commitment, and then to value what kinds of understanding it results in.
Yeah. So what counts as bang for your buck has to be extremely different when you're
really
dealing with
does, yeah.
long-term collaborative commitments, where a lot of what you're doing might not be publicly available in certain senses because it's
Absolutely.
by, it really shifts. Yeah. So I take it part of what you're saying is there's this aspect in which it's fundamentally transformative of the usual academic structures, simply in virtue of it being kind of having this open-ended aspect, having this dialogue-y and giving over of ownership aspect, it not being extractive. And it's really interesting because once you put that, suddenly you see just how extractive standard models of science really are, right? It really makes you sort of, gosh, that's really, in the lecture I gave on Tuesday, I sort of ran through sort of standard ways of thinking about ethnographic analogy, having just explained decolonization. It was like, oh crap, that looks really extractive, right? There doesn't seem to be any sort of give back in that sort of basic model, which it never occurred to me before, right? Because that's just sort of how you do science. But so, we should. Oh yeah, you respond.
I was going to say, there's in the U.S. So I moved back to Canada 3 years ago, but I was 20 years in the U.S. and in the U.S. National Science Foundation and other agencies have a congressional mandate to require that any grant proposal must address not only what the intellectual value of the project is, but also what its broader impact will be. And there's a lot of wrangling about what broader impact can be. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm going to go off and, do my work on Isaac Newton and I'll give a couple of public lectures. Maybe I'll go talk to some kids in a classroom, right? Or archaeology, similarly, I'm going to work on my pointy-headed, internally defined, disciplinarily recognized problem. And then I'll do some plain language, whatever, couple of interviews. Or others are really building into the whole design of their projects, their research programs, engagement. And so that in having sat on these NSF panels, you could really see the difference between the sort of superficial, we'll try to figure a way to get some results out there, and is really deeply rethinking how you do business and what the questions are. Emergent design of projects, for example, recognized in Canadian funding regime. But yeah, even though it is required for NSF proposals, those who are doing the building in, the really deeply embedded social impact considerations, I would say are generally disadvantaged in getting funding. Because the other pressure is that, the funding panels want to be able to say there will be a bang for your buck. There will be a deliverable after 3 years of NSF funding. And to realize that, the kind of control that hit and run projects, that extractive projects give you, is absolutely essential.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. All right, so I hope everyone forgives me for having monopolized Alison for so long. But let's take a 5-minute break and come back at in 5 minutes, at 5 past the hour, and we will open the floor. So we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so as we all start coming in, as I'll say for the 7th time, I noticed that you can tell that this is going to be a lively session, by the way, that I don't even have to explain that you should raise your hands in the Zoom room before people start going. But if you wish to ask Alison a question, I'm sure she'll pop in a second. You may raise your hand using the reaction function. You may throw something into the chat, or you may, I guess, waggle your hands around so that I can see you and I shall sort of put you on the list. So before I throw over to Alexander, we'll just wait to make sure that Alison's here. So we'll awkwardly pause.
I'm here.
Excellent. Alexander, take it away.
Thank you. It's not about griffins.
I want to know more about griffins.
Oh, well, anytime you like. It's sort of, I guess, a naive question, but I'm troubled with it for quite a long time, and now have an opportunity to ask you, what do you think about it? That is how to confront and how to deal with pseudo scientific claims
Mhm.
within archaeology and outside archaeology, without diverting to rigid positivism, testing hypothesis, falsification, and so on, and acknowledging postmodern, post-colonial views, other views, indigenous views, public archaeology. In other words, how to discuss with Richard Pendragon and still maintaining this disciplinary attitude and methodological and theoretical boundaries of our discipline, whether we are dealing with Bosnian pyramids or Stonehenge or whatever. So I know that Monica and myself and Stasha and some of others, especially in Serbian archaeology and in Balkans archaeology, are dealing with this problem when we don't have a right solution, right theoretical and methodological solution to this problem. So perhaps you can enlighten us. Thank you.
I cannot offer a solution. I don't know that I have a solution. But these kinds of issues come up in, in context of Indigenous and archaeology collaborations a lot. And one thing, so I'm not sure how to answer this. I was going to say one question that people doing collaborative practice almost always get, like in any public forum where I've seen them give presentations, an audience question will be, well, so it worked out for you, in this case, the archaeology converged on the Indigenous, oral tradition, understanding of the history. But what about cases when you hit a wall and you just have to disagree? And in the number of times that archaeologists doing the work say, well, that just doesn't really happen a lot. We have a conversation, it's not that different from if you're in an interdisciplinary collaboration with somebody in another research field and you disagree and you talk it through and try to find a way you could work together. And if you can't, you go your separate ways. It's a negotiative process. So that's in that context. And I don't know that there's a lot of wisdom to draw from that to what you're describing. But another type of case is one where where Indigenous communities are put in positions of contesting one another about, say with land claims. And they'll be appealing to oral tradition, oral history, to make competing claims, and the archaeology supports one rather than the other. And let's say, and so the archaeologist, one who was describing this case said that it was really difficult because you didn't want to be dispossessing one community, supporting one at the expense of another, and the whole contestation over in a legal frame is, winner takes all, and anyway, it's just a disaster. So sometimes the response in that case, I can think of a couple of articles where archaeologists describe cases where they decided to step back and not do or not publish the archaeology because it could only deepen divisions that they understood to be destructive for one community or another, or for all of them. That's not the kind of case you're describing. And I'm not sure exactly what to say. And it's a particularly, I think what you're describing is particularly salient now, where social media kinds of frenzies, sort of post-truth era, and claims like, this is my belief, and people get into a kind of echo chamber and reproduce and amplify a particular set of beliefs, and they're completely unresponsive to evidence of any kind. And I guess I'm a conservative enough epistemologist that I want to say there's something that could be described as epistemic irresponsibility, and people need to be called on it. you know, maybe not like in your face, you're wrong. How could you possibly believe this? Are you a moron? Right? Which tends to be the way the online discussions go. But some kind of engagement where there could be some, you know, drawing of attention to evidence, some kind of eliciting what the background assumptions are that inform the view. I taught an intro course last summer for my sins. We have several intro courses. One's mainly epistemology. And I decided I didn't really want to be teaching an intro course, certainly not in the summer. And I just, since I had to, I thought, the hell with it, you're going to get one heck of an intro course. And so I designed one that was on knowledge you can trust, knowledge you can't, and how to tell the difference. And I made use of a philosophical article on bullshit, which distinguishes bullshit from lies, for example, and various other kinds of prevarication. Also drew some resources from a co-edited book called Calling Bullshit, which is written by two scientists, an information science guy and an evolutionary biology guy. And they're, you know, they are walking through not only many of the kinds of evidential, what counts as good use of evidence that we discuss in philosophy, but also strategies for engagement, that where there's a moral dimension to it. You know, where you have to find out how to engage the interlocutors in a place where they could hear some of what you're saying, but then, yeah. So again, this is cold comfort. I don't know that there's, you know, some people argue in bad faith and you may never be able to convince them, but I think there is a place for calling bullshit. Well, bullshit, by contrast to lying, somebody actually is keeping two sets of books. They know, they don't care, right? Sorry, I put this the wrong way. Lying is when you know what's the case, but you misrepresent it deliberately. Bullshit is when you don't care what's the case, you just say whatever.
Yeah, it's indifference to the truth as opposed to going against the truth.
Exactly. Yeah. Did you guys talk about this already?
Oh no, it's just
No.
that the on bullshit stuff has sort of become very standard fodder of kind of. I know you were claiming this was a very radical, but this is something that is talked about often. But maybe something to very quick interjection here. I mean, I take it that one of the things that, like, speaking as, you know, someone who's not from you know, this part of Europe and comes from very far away, as you do as well, Alison, the extent to which archaeology has traditionally been fundamentally a tool of power in this part of the world is something which I find really difficult to keep in mind, right? And a lot of what you were saying was very reasonable, but I guess there's this interesting question: how do you be an archaeologist when you know, the vast majority of archaeology that is sort of taken seriously has been so clearly in the service of narratives that you find kind of deeply damaging is something that, like, I didn't begin to have an answer to that, nor should you have to, but I thought I would just sort of make Alexander's question more pointed and see.
Yeah, no, Alexander has every right to be totally frustrated with everything I said, because it's not responsive to, I'm not responding to the kind of situation you're describing. But let me see. I think in a context where, a cat has just walked by. Anyway, in a context where archaeology has been done for nationalists to sustain particular kinds of nationalist claims, I think one of the crucial things that needs to happen, and archaeologists do this, and historians do this, more cat, is to do genealogies of the critical genealogies of the archaeology. And I think of this as a kind of Hassek-Chang complementary history philosophy of science with an attitude. You're doing it for critical purpose, to identify why, and it goes all the way down to, you know, descriptive categories built into site recording forms, and all the way up to the range of hypotheses that are being considered in interpreting data. But what were the assumptions that drove the formation of questions and the design of research practices? and scrutinize those. I mean, it can be politically, you could cost you your life. It could be politically and professionally disastrous. But I think that's the kind of intervention that's required, is to make visible the ways in which the archaeology has been driven by a set of assumptions that should be questioned. So I was using an example in these lecture that I gave yesterday for the McDonald of Musqueam, which is the indigenous community on whose territory UBC, where I live and work, where it's based, where it's located. There's a beautiful history, These Mysterious People by Susan Roy, of the relationship, the dynamics, the history of interaction between the Musqueam and archaeologists, including Boaz back in, the turn of the century before last, and then up through Borden, who essentially developed the regional synthesis that everybody still uses in the Pacific Northwest. And essentially she's showing how eliminationist ideology, settler eliminationist ideology, that indigenous people have disappeared or will disappear, or if they're around, they're not authentic, how that profoundly configured the archaeology for over 100 years in the form of they were never here, but that the genuine, authentic, original inhabitants of this fabulous settlement, Musqueam settlement called Sesnaam or Marpole Midden, that they had been displaced by a warlike group that came in from the interior. So it's not the northern hordes, it's the interior hordes that come and culturally rich, original Musqueam, or original.
So I think maybe people I think it might not just be me. We're having a bit of trouble on Alison's end for the internet. So hopefully she'll be back in a moment. So we'll have a quick pause. I want to make sure we've lost her entirely. Cambridge, it's like it's a great place, but their internet's terrible. Alison, you're back. Wonderful.
I'm back. That's an example, and that kind of work by an historian, I think, is really crucial. She puts that archaeological history in a broader political context. So that's one of the kinds of things you can do. And actually, Gonzalez Ruibal, I think the kinds of things he describes that archaeology can contribute by way of documentation of, disappeared histories, marginalized histories, violence that continues in the presence that's, disavowed. Though that's right, that's work to be done.
Yeah.
But I don't know that, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we should move to Monica, but yeah.
Thank you very much for being with us, Alison. So
Yeah.
I will be really quick. So it's really difficult to imagine collaborative archaeology from Balkans perspective because of nationalistic movements, raising of populism and nationalism. But I'm thinking about good examples from Europe. So with indigenous people. So would you say that, for example, archaeological work with Sami communities in Northern Europe is a good example from European context?
I don't know a lot about it, but I know there is contestation that Sami have been continuously kind of colonized, but that they themselves are incomers. I just recently heard that, so I don't know what the story is there, but yeah, if there are, I don't know. I hear that there is collaborative work being done in that context and that it's been productive, but I don't know the details. Yeah, so this isn't very helpful. Can you say a bit about what that looks like?
Well, what I know just from articles, it's not much collaborative, but it's kind of respectful relation and maybe respectful negotiation between scientific communities. And it's interesting how it is done in Norway, for example, with Sami communities, and also in northern Russia, because it's extremely different impact on Sami community and its same, let's say, same culture. So it's good to compare, for example, in context of Norway and Russia, how that heritage is treated today. So maybe that's good to think about.
Worth looking at. Yeah. There's one thing that occurs to me in connection with both of these two questions. There's an article, I mentioned it in the paper you have, by Audrey Horning. It's in the collection of essays I was commenting on. She's Irish. She works in Northern Ireland. She works in Ireland, and she was one who González Ruibal, sort of reamed out and was saying, "Oh, this is just sort of flaccid liberalism, right? She's not taking a stand, and she's not telling the people what they need to know." And I was really impressed by the paper I heard her give in the original session, and then what she says in her paper. And she argues she is on the side of peace in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. She's not taking a side. She has stakes. I mean, she is Irish, but she's not taking a side, one side or the other, and pushing, one view or the other. What she wants to do is draw attention to the complexity of the history that has been reduced to polarized opposition. And from the sounds of what she was saying and the kinds of case examples she was giving when in her paper and in her talk, when she does that in a kind of interrogative spirit rather than a declarative one, actually people who would take sides very strongly are quite intrigued to hear what the connections between Catholic and Protestant have been over the years, and how Protestant enclave came to be established in Ireland, and how complex that history is. So it's a matter of unraveling. It's using the archaeology to sort of unravel some of these rigid, polarizing narratives. And that might, so what I'm suggesting is it might not be that collaborative practice is the way to go. It might be that something like these critical genealogies or uses of archaeology to mobilize, more complex understanding could be a way to pursue goals of peacemaking in a deeply divided context. She made the point that the language of collaboration, even if she is working with local communities, she could never use the language of collaboration. In an Irish context, somebody who's a collaborator is someone who's betrayed their family and community. So the term collaboration is not a positive term. And that might well be the case in the Baltic countries, I don't know, but I got it instantly when she said it, having some Irish heritage, and it's like, whoa, I had never thought about that. So she's positioning herself precisely not to be driving one archaeology for one line or the other. Yeah.
I guess the difference might be like collaborative archaeology in the indigenous context. It's a context where it's very, very clear who you're working, like it's clear what punching down or punching up is when you're working in those indigenous contexts, or at least it's more clear.
It's more clear. It gets messy because of internal divisions within communities, traditional leadership versus elected leadership, where elected leadership are like the mandated chief and council by, Canadian governance systems, where communities are put at odds because they've always had deeply entangled histories. But as I said earlier, when they're making land claims, they have to nail continuous occupation to some piece of land. And there's always a neighbor who had use rights and access and so on traditionally. So it gets messy fast, but I think you're right. Like with respect to settlers and dispossession of land over the course of 200 to 300 years, it's pretty clear. Yeah. It's way more complicated in Baltic and UK context. Yeah.
Speaking of way more complicated, I'll pass things over to Igor.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for the beautiful discussion, Alison and Adrian. I will focus once again something I said the last time we discussed this paper. I will return to the Balkan context. I always felt that this kind of decolonization, indigenous archaeological theoretical framework is very American-centric and imperial-centric, and is not very applicable to the Balkans, where the more indigenous and autochthonous you want to present yourself, the more nationalistic, chauvinistic, and genocidal you are. So it's kind of a real problem when, especially from local non-professional archaeological communities, you have pseudo-archaeological theories that support some indigenous claim that in turn has a genocidal potential in the future. So in this case, I think that collaborative archaeology should be more in the direction of something like more rigid scientific archaeological collaboration between archaeologists from different countries than in a sense talking to the local communities, because some borderline where there's mixed communities, there's problems with these questions of who is indigenous, who is autochthonous, and that can in turn result in chauvinism and nationalistic claims. So I don't know, I think that in the Balkans stuff are really more complicated. So I think that more rigid archaeological professionalism is more something which has greater impact, could have greater impact in the Balkans than in fact talking to some local notions that promote pseudo-archaeological claims. That's my 2 cents to the discussion.
I guess I don't see, I mean, yeah, American-centric or, yeah, the collaborative archaeology literature is centered on context where there's internal colonization, right? As opposed to external colonization, as opposed to, again, the kind of situation in the Baltics, in the UK itself, where, you know, all kinds of populations have run over all kinds of other populations, and there are a lot of contesting claims. So I don't know that, you know, focusing on a particular type of colonization, internal colonization, where settlers came to stay. They weren't just extracting resources that were going back to the metropole. Settlers, you know, expropriated lands, you know, yeah. I don't know that focusing on a particular constellation of problems and strategies for responding to them in that context should be seen as, I don't quite understand the argument here, as inherently chauvinist and genocidal. If that's the suggestion.
Well, I might jump in on Igor's. I might jump in on
Yeah.
Igor's, if I may, Igor. Like, I take it the point is something like the context he's speaking about, are a little bit like I made that joke earlier about any British person who proudly claims themselves indigenous is probably not someone that I should want to collaborate with as an archaeologist, at least uncritically. I take it the worry is something like if you have that model of collaborative archaeology, and do come in if I'm not getting it right, Igor. That model of collaborative archaeology seems as if it's not really applicable to the Balkans, because you're in a sort of situation where the more you sort of, as it were, give voice to their indigeneity, the more that feeds into sort of very regressive, sort of nationalistic sorts of things. And so I take it the thought was, in that case, actually the more sort of, here's a objective way of giving you just what actually happened in the past. That version of archaeology is perhaps what is more useful. That's
so that's Gonzalez Ruibel's argument. And yeah, I mean, strategically, that might be the most effective intervention for some purposes, but I don't even know what to say about that. It seems like the arrogance of thinking that you know objectively what is the case and you don't have to talk to people who are making contesting claims. I find that pretty chauvinist and worrisome. But the point I've been making in answer to several questions is that I don't think, you asked, to what extent could the collaborative practice with indigenous communities, could that be extended to other contexts? I don't assume that it can be. You need to ask what kind of political division, what kind of systems of oppression, what kind of, if you're dealing with a colonial situation, what kind of colonialism? There are lots of different kinds of colonialism. And then ask the question, what role has archaeology played in entrenching and sustaining those oppressive systems? And what role could archaeology play, if any, in undoing some of that, in my case, colonial legacy. So I guess I'm not making a claim that collaborative practice should, of the kind I've been interested in, should be exported to any other context.
So
Right.
before I throw back to Igor, if I just want to double check. I know, Alison, you're actually pretty cut for time. So I
Yeah,
just want
getting
to.
there, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you have a few more minutes, or are
I
you?
do, yeah.
Okay, so Igor, I'll let you respond, and then we'll go to the last question in the big room.
Yes.
Okay.
I would rather give my time to someone else if he wants to take a question. So I can come back.
Okay, so suffice to say, it's a complicated and extremely difficult question.
Yes. The
How
question
one might...
is that there are, for example, there are two peoples in the Balkans, and one people has claimed a territory before. They are more indigenous than the other. This rises to nationalistic tendencies. That country that we should attack our neighbor to take their land back because we were indigenous in that land. And this was supported in the past by archaeological claims from professional archaeologists that dig into pseudo-archaeological claims. We have even today some questions that, I don't know, Macedonians or Serbians existed 20,000 years ago, and they're the autochthonous population in the Balkans, and we shall expel all others from the Balkans. Like, that is a big mindset among some of the local population. And I think that archaeological research that goes beyond nationalistic borders, when you say, yes, maybe some people, you were here indigenous, I don't know, 5,000 years ago, but that doesn't matter today because you have no right to expel me or genocide me because 5,000 years ago you lived in the territory where I am now. Like, that's very complicated stuff in the Balkans.
Yeah, well, and I think in the kind of case you're describing, then my reply earlier to Monica, that maybe what's called for is critical genealogy of how the archaeology has been systematically distorted. And I'm prepared to stand, one can make claims, I think, well grounded in the case of that I was describing in the internal colonialism that Boaz was a party to. You can show how crucial evidence was systematically marginalized, read out of account in order to construct a narrative archaeologically supported by the best scientific archaeology, the foundational scientific archaeology in the region, that the Musqueam, the contemporary Musqueam, are not related to the original inhabitants. So in that sense, it's a very similar situation. Yes. And I think the intervention in that case, involves both critical genealogy of the archaeology, what was, and then constructive archaeology that's bringing back into view the way Audrey Horning is doing in Ireland, back into view some of the complexities and the entanglement in the region. To the extent that that's possible, that might be a constructive role archaeology could play. Yes. So yeah, I don't think collaborative practice where it's no, like, elite capture is a term that's now in circulation in philosophy. I don't think, like just deferring to people who claim that they're indigenous because they claim they're indigenous, that's a non-starter, and that's no part of the kind of collaborative practice, even in internal colonial contexts, that I'm advocating. There's a lot of skirmishing about who, what indigeneity is, and who counts.
So let's, for the final time in the session, and then in this course, throw it to the big room, which usually means
there's that big room. All of you.
Yeah. Well, this time it's not Slobodan Perovic, it's Stasha Babic from the big room, since it's archaeological very much today, so it has to be me. Okay, well, I will just try and make things even more messy. There have been quite a lot of works in archaeology of the Balkans in deconstructing the narratives that are helping chauvinistic and nationalistic abuses of archaeology. So we've been doing that, and we are frustrated because we are not getting too far, and that's perhaps where Alexander's first question came from. But talking about the implementation of postcolonial theory in archaeology, I just wanted to add an anecdote. quite a lot of archaeologists working in Britain and working especially in Roman archaeology have been applying post-colonial studies, especially people from Durham. I don't know if you've ever met Richard Hingley and yeah. So they've been doing it. In fact, they've been deconstructing the idea of the British Empire, which was founded, in fact, on the idea of the Roman Empire. And so that circular motion of interpreting Roman archaeology by the notions of the British Empire while living in it. For example, the guy called Haverfield, Francis Haverfield, who coined the idea of Roman supremacy and Romanization and so on. So these guys started deconstructing the idea on the grounds of post-colonial theory. They started, in fact, showing how the colonial ideology of the British Empire was founded on the on the ideas of the Roman imperialism. And they've been doing it for ages, and I've been following what they were doing. And one time, Richard Hingley told me, now I'm really messed up because I understand while deconstructing the imperial Roman narrative, I am giving agency to the Britons, and I'm in fact liberating the ones who are then in their own turn starting to colonize others. So what the hell am I doing? I'm giving agency to the people who I want to, in the ultimate end of my analysis, make culpable for what they've been doing. So it's kind of a vicious circle that really gives us the perspective how archaeological interpretations can be tricky when we are speaking about post-colonialism. So it's not a question, it's just like comment to what we've been talking about for the last half hour. Thank you.
Yeah, because I was going to say, I think the fact that one deconstructive project serves a purpose of showing how the British Empire legitimated itself, disappeared, in falsifying ways, right? The fact that doesn't eradicate or undercut all other forms of colonialism or ambitions of empire, it doesn't seem to me what's the word, delegitimize, or makes irrelevant, or suggests that you should never have undertaken the deconstruction of the imperial narrative. It means that other narratives need to be deconstructed. And in the case of the British Isles, I mean, there's like, who's indigenous? Is it people from the continent? Is it people from Nordic countries? Is it, I mean, who are Saxons? Who are Angles? Who are, I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah, that's what I think he was referring to. I don't think that his idea is, why the hell was I doing this? And I too think it is a very important project and it's still ongoing. So he's not kind of giving up. He's just saying that there is always, like an onion, there is always the next layer of doing it. There is always the next layer of another cycle of inclusions and exclusions that you have to have in mind when you're doing it. So that's what I think he had in mind when he said that. Yeah, not that the whole story is simply not worth doing, but that it should be done even more and even more carefully. That's how I read that.
Yeah, and that's consistent with when I was a colleague of his at Durham. That's consistent with what I was hearing from him. And I heartily agree with that. It's not like one and done. You deconstruct an imperial narrative of, about Rome and the British Empire, and then it's sorted. I mean, I think what you said is exactly right. That takes me back to, in a sense, to the Audre Lorde and the master's tools. The thing about colonial systems and imperial ambitions is that they are as mechanisms of governance and operating in the world, they're incredibly adept at appropriating narratives of resistance and putting them to work for themselves. So you might get your point about frustration, that you're not getting traction where you would hope to, suggests that no matter how much archaeology you do or how much deconstructive narrative analysis you do, unless there's political action effective to organize a community to counteract some of these power structures. You're not going to, the narrative reconstruction and the archaeology aren't going to get traction on their own. They have to be part of political action more broadly conceived. I take it that's the point, but I still don't see that justifies the kind of Gonzalez Ruibal line that somehow he knows, what people's interests are. I find that quite problematic.
So I don't know about you all, but I feel a little bit like the last 7 weeks has been this kind of loss of innocence sort of thing, where we've sat in these like airy clouds and thought about like how we have knowledge of the past, and then we've learned about sort of like how fossil preparation, it looked very, very messy, and we looked at sort of the history of paleontology, and suddenly things got even messier, and now we're sort of down in this sort of situation where the sort of inherent political nature of trying to understand the past has been laid bare in all of its complex mess. I want to first off thank Alison for spending so much time with us, and also for sort of speaking so eloquently about these issues that frankly make me want to hide under my table and never come out.
Yeah, you're making me want to like just go do fossil preparation and
it's so much safer. And also, I really, wish it was sort of closing up. Thank you so much for those of this felt like a very strange experiment, and it's been extremely successful as far as I can tell. And so I really want to thank you all for your attention and coming along and being attentive and stuff. I've really enjoyed this.
So we share the feelings in the big room. Everybody's agreeing with you. Yes, thanks.
great.
Yeah. So thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon, Alison, and everyone else here. Stay in touch. You have my email. Let me know if there's a thing you want to talk to me about or whatever. I hope you all have. I presume it's as hot in Belgrade as it is currently in Bucharest. If so, enjoy it being too hot.
It is hot. Thank you.
See you all.